Here all, in today's Crack the Code series, we are going to understand the transformative journey of GST in the last 7 years. GST was introduced in the year 2017. Currently, we are in 2024. In the next 25 to 30 minutes, let us understand what are the reforms that has taken place in GST and how GST has traveled in the last 7 years. When we started our journey in GST in the year 2017, we were under the impression that the GST is going to be one act, and if we learn thoroughly the act, we'll be well versed with all provisions and we'll be in a comfortable position to advise the clients. But is GST is one GST and one and only GST? If you ask me, the answer is quite difficult because it is just not GST. It consists of various other laws connected to GST and also allied laws which are indirectly connected to GST. So let's go in detail. What all the things that we have to be thorough with when we are saying that we are going to advise on GST. First is that when I say GST, it comprises of state laws, state GST, respective states GST and CGST and IGST, and of course the compensation cess related acts also we have to be thorough with. Apart from that, there are rules connected with the CGST, so that also we have to keep in mind. Over and above that, there are humongous number of notifications which were issued in the last 7 years. We have to keep ourselves updated with the notifications, and circulars are also, though it is binding on the department, the circulars which are favorable and circulars which are clarificatory in nature, we have to necessarily read, understand and use it for the best advantage of our clarity. Apart, there are certain removal of difficulty orders as well. So when I say GST allied laws, we have to appreciate the law by connecting it with how the other laws are indirectly impacting or influencing, or what way it is going to have relevance when we apply the provisions directly to GST. One such example is, say, Income Tax Act. Income Tax Act and Companies Act, company law are the basic laws which are directly connected to GST, because when we do some auditing, it is just not the GST that matters, how the accounting standards have been followed in the company, what are the company law related provisions, and how the balance sheet has been reported, balance sheet items are reported, and how the treatment of income tax with respect to certain issues or needs to be holistically understood for us to advise on GST. So when I say other connected and related laws, let me tell you with an example. If you are auditing or advising a client on transport who's into transportation of vehicles or rent a cab service, first and foremost, we have to understand the technicalities involved in any business for that matter. So when we are advising the client on rent a cab, and when we read the connected notifications, we will come across certain jargons relating to that industry, say 800cc vehicle, 13-seater capacity. So when we read those terminologies, it is very imperative for us to go to the respective laws, say Motor Vehicle Act, and understand what is the definition of vehicle, motor vehicle, all the other related definitions, so that we will be in a position to appreciate better and understand and advise the clients in a better way. So is it restricted only to that laws? The answer is no, because in the last 7 years, the GST has evolved very well. We have to understand what is there in the mind of the department, how the law has been looked at from the department, the nuances in the interpretational issues also needs to be kept in mind. So for that, what we need to do is we have to understand how the advance rulings are all addressed by the authorities. Our experts and seniors generally advise that not to get into advance ruling, but still in my humble opinion, just to understand how the interpretation has been looked at, how the law has been looked at from various angles. It's better for us to refer. We may not have to follow because the advance ruling decisions are only restricted to the assessee or the taxpayer who has applied for it. But still, we can always, for our better understanding and enriching our knowledge, we can understand how the arguments were placed before the authorities and how it was represented with the higher authorities, appellate authority for advance ruling. We can always read and understand. And also, there are decisions which are coming up in the High Court, in various other states of High Courts, where we can take it as a precedence for our cases. If somebody wants to specialize in litigation, we cannot restrict ourselves with studying only GST. It's very important for us to read the related notifications, latest updates, connected laws, and also the advance rulings that have come up and given the diverse opinion by different states on the same matters, so that we'll have the clarity on how the law can be interpreted when the real issues are placed before us. And also, in the recent times, if you look at it, there are various Supreme Court writ petition decisions have come out. So to understand the law in a better way, we have to read even the decisions. The tribunal is yet to be formed. Apart from that, then and there we are able to see the Twitters, which is also considered as one of the official communications of department, and the press releases also we have to keep track of. Now, in the last 7 years, let us understand how the process of registration with the GST authorities has been evolved in the last 7 years. First, when the migration was happening from various other laws, say for example, the taxpayer who was registered under VAT had to migrate to GST. The taxpayer who had registered under service tax had to migrate to GST. So there were many taxpayers who were registered under state laws and central laws, had to be migrated by giving their previous registration, and the onboarding into GST was happening very smoothly without any issues by giving their basic PAN card details and Aadhaar details and address proof and other details. So the registration was basically taking only about a week's time, and approval was happening very quickly. Then what happened? The credits that were accumulated in the previous tax regime had to be carried forward in the new GST Act also. It was done through the electronic form called Tran1, and it was getting transmitted into GSTR 3B in the form of ITC. That was also happening. And of course, there are many taxpayers who had missed the due dates, and the petitions were filed till to the High Court, and many of them got the relief. But said that, where do we stand now with respect to registration? If you ask me, we transitioned from 7 days of registration to immediate registration. It means that initially when GST was introduced, it was taking about 7 days of time. Then later, when GST was introduced for a period of up to 2019, 2020, we had absolutely no problem. There was no physical verification of premises, business premises, and online submission forms were there, and we were able to amend the core field. Everything was happening very smooth. But later, in the recent times, in the last 3 years, 2 years, I would say, there were difficulties. The taxpayers, the new registered aspiring taxpayers were put to difficulty because of certain malpractices done by few taxpayers. In the sense, the taxpayer had fraudulently submitted the records of other persons, due to which the fake registrations were happening. So department stopped the registration without physical verification. Currently, again, we are back to square one where the physical verification is happening and the Aadhaar authentication is happening through Aadhaar facilitation centers. Again, the time for registration has moved from 7 days to 30 days. So where are we with respect to 7 years of GST? Where have we traveled if you ask me? We are again back to the old regime of physical verification, physical submission of document, physical interaction with the department, and the time for registration has also gone up from 7 days to 3 weeks to 4 weeks. So this is where we stand after 7 years of introduction of GST with respect to registration process. If you ask me, where do we stand with respect to cancellation of registration, whether suo motu registration cancellation is done by officers or voluntary cancellation needs to be done by the taxpayer, where do we stand in the last 7 years? If I have to revisit, the cancellation process is definitely happening in a much faster and efficient manner than earlier regimes. So whenever the taxpayer is not complying with any of the provisions of the Act, say for example, wrong claiming of input tax credit or non-filing of returns or contravention of any of the acts, the department suspends the registration. On a suo motu basis, action is taken by the department officials. So if somebody wants to discontinue the business, yes, they can always approach the department and then submit voluntarily the cancellation along with the reason. There are certain activities which are fraudulently conducted by the taxpayer. In such case also, the suo motu cancellation process is taken by the officers. So when I say in the last 7 years, where do we stand with respect to registration and filing of forms? The filing of forms, initially when GST was introduced, they planned in such a way that GSTR1, GSTR2, and GSTR3, these three forms will be introduced, where GSTR1 will capture all the outward supply and it is going to be completely automatic. There is absolutely no manual intervention or physical records or physical submission of any documents, and payment, nothing. It's all going to be completely online. This is what was expected. Yes, the promises were all met even till date. We are 100% online when it comes to GST filing of forms and payment of taxes. So GSTR1 was introduced, which is in place. GSTR2 could not be introduced. GSTR3 also could not be followed. Instead, GSTR2A was introduced. GSTR3B was introduced in place of GSTR3. When GSTR2A was introduced, this is nothing but it acts as a purchase register for any taxpayer. It means that the idea of government when they introduced GST, every taxpayer, if he sells it to B2B, that means when transaction happens between two registered GST taxpayers, then if every taxpayer updates his or her outward supply in the online portal, then it acts as a purchase register for the other taxpayer. In simple terms, if each one of us, if each taxpayer is taking care of his own sales register, the purchase register will be taken care by some other taxpayer. He need not worry about his purchase register. That is what is GSTR2 is all about. That's what was coming up in GSTR2A. Whereas because of delayed filing of the supplier and non-filing of supplier, non-payment of taxes, the last 7 years, availing a genuine input tax credit was under question. Many taxpayers, even after making the payment, even after receiving the goods, they were put to hardship because of non-implementation of the correct process of purchase register what the government had in mind. So when I say GSTR 2A, to fix the uh, issues and deficiencies in GSTR 2A, they came out with GSTR 2B, wherein the taxpayer, when he logs into his portal to file his returns, the GSTR 2B will be auto-populated. GSTR 1, he has already entered all his outward liability, outward supplies, along with output tax. He will be disclosed. It will be disclosed and it will be appearing, and it will get auto-populated in the GSTR 3B. GSTR 2B is a purchase register which is taken care by the other taxpayer, other suppliers. So he need not worry about the input tax credit, and what he needs to pay is just the payment. Log into the GSTR 3B, which is a summary return, which will comprise of output tax and input tax credit, and the balance after offset of input tax credit with the output tax credit, output liability, the net needs to be paid through online on the assigned due date. So this is what was expected, but because of various reasons, due dates and then payment mechanism, technical glitches, we faced a lot of difficulties, but I would say we were able to achieve the efficiency to the extent of 80% in this by even after change of forms and other difficulties. Later, one difficulty which was consistently faced by the taxpayer was that there was no provision to amend, there was no provision to rectify any return. This was the difficulty faced by all the taxpayers, because they had to follow certain procedures and nuances if they want to edit any tax field for unintentional errors committed by the taxpayer. So to fix that, GSTR 1A was introduced with with the conditional timelines and conditional fields. If they go through all that, then only the filing, the GSTR 1 form can be rectified through GSTR 1A. Now the invoice management system is in place, wherein the taxpayer can accept, reject, or keep it on hold, defer it for the next month, so that he can take his own action by looking at the records, taking some time in finding out whether the tax credit that is appearing is due to him or not. He can even defer it. So that kind of facilities also has come up in the last few months. So this is a welcoming change. So if I have to summarize it in one word, in terms of filing, definitely we are reaching the 100% of efficiency in the months to come. It's time for us to understand where do we stand with respect to filing of returns within due date. Having two returns in hand, and for sometimes multiple registrations taken in different states, different parts of India, how do we comply with all the filing of returns within due date? So one given thing in hand was time is essence. Irrespective of whether it is a working day, non-working day, there was absolutely no relaxation in filing of returns. The due date of filing the returns were fixed, whether it was a holiday, holiday due to festival, or any other holiday, it was not considered. So the stiff timeline was maintained, and no revision of return was permitted. Only amendment through specific format only was allowed. So this is one of the critical thing about when it comes to filing of returns within the time period. When I say monthly returns, the due date becomes, for GSTR 1, it is 11th of the subsequent month. And when it say GSTR 3B for monthly filers, it is 20th of the subsequent month. And IFF for QRMP taxpayers, different timeline. On a quarterly, they have to file it. And for IFF, different monthly due dates. And when it comes to payment of taxes, it was 25th For QRMP and for others, it was 20th. And for some states, there are staggered filing of returns were allowed. So these were the things which they had to keep in mind when they want to file the returns. Having said so, even input tax credit availment was also with strict deadlines. The taxpayer who had filed his GSTR1 within due date only could pass on the benefit of availing the input tax credit to his buyer within 14th of the subsequent month, or else the buyer could avail the input tax credit only in the subsequent month. So these were some of the intricacies which evolved over a period of time. When GST was introduced, we were under the impression that everybody will file on time. All the taxpayer will be very transparent, will not make any errors. So when GST was designed, in particular the filing and compliance was concerned, it was kept in mind that all taxpayers will have complete knowledge of all the provisions, whereas in reality it was not so, due to which there were a lot of practical issues which crop up. But with the guidance of experts and professionals, the taxpayers' cooperation, they could file the returns on time with minimal errors, and corrections were also possible in the form of amendments or through GSTR9, which was a final return, annual return, which had stiff deadline of 31st December or any time before, whenever the books of accounts were closed, they were allowed to file the annual returns once the forms were released, with a condition that if your turnover is more than 5 crore, it is compulsory for any taxpayer to file GSTR 9 and 9C, which is a reconciliation return. So in GST, with respect to timeline is concerned, it is very stiff unless and until you follow all the clauses, all the conditions in a strict manner. There were due penalties, interest were levied. Even for 1 day of late filing, there were late filing fees were levied by the department, which was by the system driven calculation of late fee was levied. And even on interest, even if there is a delay of 1 day, interest was calculated and auto populated. So this is where we stand with respect to filing of returns and availment of input tax credit. When it comes to input tax credit, if I have to look back and see where do we stand today from 2017, when GST was introduced, the minute input tax credit, the word comes to our ears, seamless flow of credit was going hand in hand. So we were thinking, if you buy any goods or services from any registered taxpayer, if there is a GST element involved in it, then the input the taxpayer who's paying that to that supplier or to the service provider, he is eligible to avail the input tax credit. But less we realized that the input tax credit availment became so scary, and it became so precious, and it was denied from all corners. If I have to say in particular, one, from the Act has got its own provisions in the form of denial. One, you are eligible to take. Eligible, what I mean is that you cannot avail all the input tax credit. First and foremost, the taxpayer has to fulfill whether the input tax credit is eligible to be availed or not, and he has to have the copy that it came along with various conditions, and he should have received the goods. Over and above that, he has to file the returns for availing that input tax credit. Over and above that, the supplier or the service provider also should have filed his returns. Only then the taxpayer can avail the input tax credit. Furthermore, the last but not the least, the service recipient or the buyer should have paid the seller the complete value of that invoice along with the taxes. Only then the input tax credit availment comes to the fullest form. Otherwise, it was broken into pieces, then input tax credit was denied. These are all the basic pillars under which the input tax credit itself was constructed, which we realized only when we passed through after 1 or 2 years. And when I say act, these were all provided in the act. When I say rules, rule has got its own mechanism of blocking the input tax credit, availing the input tax credit, availing proportionate input tax credit. Say Rule 42, when somebody is rendering exempted supplies and taxable supplies, the availment of input tax credit was eligible only on a proportionate basis. And there were quantum of input tax credit eligibility was also, it was not at 100%. It was coming down from 90%, 70%. Then it has come to the point where unless and until it is appearing in the GST or 2B, the taxpayer cannot avail the input tax credit. So that is where we stand today as on 2024 when it comes to rules. When I say system, not only the act stipulates conditions, the rules define certain eligibility norms for availing input tax credit. The system has got its own way of blocking the input tax credit or filtering the input tax credit. You cannot edit the input tax credit eligibility, assuming if the input tax credit is X, you cannot put X plus delta X. You may have the bills, you may have the input tax credit valid, but still the system does not permit, because the system has its own set of rules saying you have to reverse in temporary reversal, in permanent reversal, in specified columns. So system was driving its own set of rules for filtering the input tax credit. So that was also creating difficulties for the taxpayer. All these things, when GST was introduced in 2017, we never realized, but over a period of time, 2024, when we stand today, we face these kind of issues when the system is driving its own way of preventing the input tax credit. Over and above that, the department has got its own way of blocking the input tax credit. In the sense, if you have not filed your tax returns, or if there are any exceptional transactions, the input tax credit was automatically blocked by the department from the back end. So these are some of the challenges that we faced, which we never expected when GST was introduced. And supplier had his own mischief in blocking the input tax credit. So he was not filing the returns on time. So even to the supplier, the recipient could not pay it on time. So these were all some of the major elements which contributed to the blocking or availing the input tax credit in a seamless way. So if I have to put it in a nutshell, whether input tax credit is seamlessly available, this is what was promised when GST was introduced. And after 7 years, where we stand, I would say the input tax credit is so precious. It's your eligible credit, but for availing, you have to be extremely careful. And comes with various riders. We have to be availing the input tax credit has become a big challenge as we stand today. Now let us understand where do we stand with respect to e-way bill. You all know that e-way bill concept was not introduced in 2017. Subsequently, it was introduced. Karnataka being the pioneer, because we had already a system in place called e-Sugam even much before e-way bill. So adapting e-way bill was not very difficult for taxpayer who were registered under Karnataka. But having said that, the e-way bill created very smooth movement of goods, and it made the process very simple. And from generating e-way bill was very quick. the taxpayer had absolute transparency and trust in the system. However, there were certain difficulties in the last 7 years in terms of administering the law, administrators of law, and also the taxpayers' small errors or unintentional arithmetical errors also caused huge losses to the taxpayer. The e-way bill deviation from the guidelines was considered as a strict offense. So the vehicles were detained, the penalties were levied, the taxpayers were made to pay the taxes first along with penalty, and then if required, if the department is satisfied, then only the refund was credited to the taxpayer. So these are some of the difficulties faced by the taxpayer when it comes to e-way bill. So one was that incorrect details in e-way bill. Second, validity period of e-way bill. The taxpayer had to be very cautious while filling up the e-way bill form in the online portal, that he cannot afford to make any error in the date or vehicle number or invoice value or rate or HSN, whatever it may be. And if he decides not to ship that order or fulfill that order, then the timeline for cancellation of e-way bill was looked at very seriously. And transporters details also had to be given in the way that was required. In case of multimodal transporters, all the other details were to be given by the taxpayer sometimes. So that created some issues for the taxpayer, but over a period of time, it has become very normal now. All the taxpayers are able to follow the guidelines issued by the department, and those issues are streamlined as we stand today in the year 2024, which is after 7 years of introduction of GST. When GST was introduced in 2017, we were under the impression that the department has got the complete data of what each taxpayer is uploading, and they have a mechanism to cross verify, and only after cross verification the input tax credits are passed on to the taxpayer, and there is a mechanism for upload details directly from e-way bill to GSTR1. So there may not be many queries from the department, so the litigation may come down as compared to the previous regimes. The interaction with the department may not be as higher as compared to the any other previous laws. So with that note, we entered into the journey of GST, whereas to our surprise, the notices issued by the departments to all taxpayers, irrespective of small, medium, or large taxpayer, all the taxpayers were receiving notices because of the automated system of issue of notices. So the notices were issued automatically, even in case of 1 rupee difference. The system generated notices were issued. The GST registration number was blocked. Registration was suspended because of not responding to notices. The majority of the notices can be bifurcated into 3 or 4. The one such was GSTR 1 and 3B difference. At the time of introduction of GST itself, we were very much reconciled that at no point of time GSTR 1 and 3B will match, because there could be some errors which we can amend it in the subsequent returns, and GSTR 1 is for outward supply, reporting for outward supply, and GSTR 3B is a summary return relating to that particular month. Considering the no provision for revision or amendment, the differences are bound to happen. That is the reason why GSTR 9 was introduced. However, the department started issuing notices for explaining the difference between GSTR 1 and 3B. RCM, non-payment of RCM on certain category of services wherever it was mandated, that were not followed by the taxpayer were served notices by the department. This is second category of notices. Third, the input tax credit, what was availed by the taxpayer in the form GSTR 3B, what was reversed by the taxpayer voluntarily, and what were blocked credit, whether it was utilized or not, what was appearing in 2A, which was not appearing in 2A, whether it is more than 2A, less than 2A. That ITC reconciliation was a common factor for every taxpayer. And last but not the least, the department had data of all the returns. Though it is a manual online filing of returns, the taxpayer was expected to submit the manual copy. It means the hard copy of the returns which were already in place in the system, but still at the time of assessment they were asked to submit those records and workings along with GSTR 9. So mapping the GSTR 1 and 3B, which were filed monthly, along with the GSTR 9, which was annual return, against what is reported in the audited financial statement, was a big exercise even for the department and for the taxpayer. Initially, we started with a very pleasant note that the notices will come down, the litigation will come down. But in the last 7 years, the litigation has gone up. The reconciliation has become a continuous affair when it comes to GST, in particular input tax credit. GST being the new law, the taxpayer had certain confusions in substantive provisions. So they had to approach the advance ruling authorities. It is fortunate or unfortunate, the taxpayer, when they approached two different states on the same issue, the same taxpayer could get two adverse, completely divergent answers from the same authorities. So the taxpayer was in a confusion on which authority to follow, which state's rulings to follow. So this was problem number one. The problem number two was that majority of the decisions given by the advance ruling authorities were favoring the department. It was not trying to consider the points put forward by the taxpayer. Third, there was no remedy after the first appeal. Tribunal was not formed. So the only recourse for the taxpayer was to knock the doors of the High Court. So the taxpayer, for even the small interpretational issues in substantive law, they were approaching the High Court. For any remedy, they were approaching the High Court. They lost faith in the advance ruling authority, and they did not have the patience to wait till the tribunal is formed. As we stand today, 2024, tribunal is yet to be formed, yet to become functional. So in the last 7 years, whatever the taxpayer had, the demands, they had no grievance mechanism. The aggrieved party had no choice but to pay the deposit, pre-deposit, and wait for their turn to appear before the appellate authorities. GST being the new law, the taxpayer expected some kind of amnesty in terms of reducing the litigation cost and also waiver for interest and penalty, whereas whatever the amnesty schemes that were introduced or the late filing fee waiver, everything comes with a rider with a lot of conditions attached to it. So if a taxpayer genuinely wants to understand the scheme that are coming up for rescue of any taxpayer, he necessarily has to approach a professional to understand whether he is eligible to take shelter under that amnesty scheme. So that is the kind of complexity we are in today in terms of GST. So when I talk about amnesty scheme, there were relaxation in terms of decriminalization of offences, which was effected in the form of amendment in the act itself. The act permitted for decriminalization of the taxpayer, so which was a welcoming move. And there were straightforward waiver of filing fee, relaxation of interest. Those were all very much available and passed on to the taxpayer in the initial years multiple times. So that was the only relief the taxpayer could get. Apart from that, if he had not understood the GST law correctly, because it's being a new law, there was no excuse. He was not pardoned in any way. So when I say waiver of interest, waiver of penalty, the taxpayer necessarily has to read all the provisions, understand whether his case fits into the amnesty scheme. If he feels that yes, it fits in, at which stage of litigation he is in, he has to measure whether it is worthwhile for him to pursue the matter to the next authority and then fight the case, contest the case, or it is advisable for him to withdraw the appeal and then go for amnesty scheme. So this is one big task that every taxpayer has to keep in mind. In the last 7 years, we have seen a lot of amnesty schemes that have come in the form of waiver of interest and penalty, late filing fee. Currently, the new section 128A has come to the rescue for many taxpayers. Those who want to litigate will have to understand the provision and the applicability of provision with respect to each type of litigation, with respect to each year. Then only he will be able to take an informed decision. So when it comes to GST in the last 7 years, where do we stand today? First and foremost, understanding the laws and allied laws, rules, notifications, circulars is very important. That's a foundation of GST. Furthermore, he or she has to be updated with the recent amendments that have taken place with respect to the rate or applicability or exemption or whatever it may be, and also keep track of judicial interpretations and changes that are impacting their industry. And also he has to keep in mind what is the risk appetite of each taxpayer, whether is it worthwhile to litigate the matter. Some exercise and evaluation needs to be done. Without doing that exercise, contesting the matter in the first level of appeal or to the tribunal may not be a fruitful exercise, because it comes with the litigation cost. Whatever may be the step, it is advisable to take an informed decision, exhausting all options with an informed view that yes, this is what the strategy that they are going to follow when it comes to disputing any matter that is in hand. So when I say GST compliance, the beginning, when we started our journey in 2017, we were thinking that it's going to be online, completely online. Just wink of an eye, you can raise the e-invoice and auto reconciliation is going to happen. And GSTR 3B is going to be a just payment process. And GST, somebody else is going to take care of your purchase register. There is no need of spending much time or seeking the advice of the professional. That was there in our mind. But in the last 7 years, where we stand today, as I speak now, the GST has occupied majority of the time of taxpayer in terms of looking into the portal, availing the input tax credit, keeping track of notices, evaluating the options for going for litigation or not, following up with the suppliers, making payments, keeping track of records, interacting with the department, interacting with the supplier, interacting with the professionals, and also keeping the portal, watch on the portal. So if you ask me where we stand today from 7 years, from the date of inception to today, definitely it has occupied majority of our time. In a way, it is good, since as true lovers of law, we like what we do, but for a taxpayer, it is time consuming exercise. So with this note, I thank all the participants for listening to this seminar. Thank you so much for your patient listening. Reach out to me for any clarifications. Thank you once again.